This is going to be an application that's going to involve the Pythagorean Theorem. It's asking us for the height of this airplane, and you can see that this is a triangle that's a right triangle because it's got that little square in the bottom left-hand corner. So just as a reminder, when you have a right triangle, the two sides that make up the right triangle are the legs. And the Pythagorean theorem says that if you take each one of the legs, usually we call the legs A and B, you square each one of them first and then add them together, that's always equal to the square of the hypotenuse being the longest side. So all we really have to do on this one is write down the Pythagorean theorem, a squared plus b squared equals c squared, and we're just going to fill in these amounts. Now the one leg we don't know, it's x, so I'm going to replace the a with an x because that's what my drawing has. The other leg is 160, so we've got 160. Now we have to square that, and that should be equal to the square of the hypotenuse, which is 650 squared. We're going to have some huge numbers in this one. I did this on my calculator and found out that 160 squared is, whoops, that should be a plus sign there. 160 squared is 25,600, and 650 squared is 422,500. Okay, now I need to solve for x. Now a lot of times when we have a quadratic and x squared, we jump into the Pythagorean, or we jump into the quadratic formula. But when you don't have an x to the first term, basically the quickest way to do it is to just get x squared by itself on one side and then extract the roots. So if we simply subtract 25,600 from both sides, we get x squared by itself, and x squared is equal to, I did this on my calculator quickly, 396,900. So now that I've got x squared by itself, all I have to do is extract the roots by taking the square root of both sides. Remember, when we take the square root of the right-hand side, we end up with two answers. And this one happened to come out evenly. X is equal to plus or minus, the square root of that turns out to be 630. Now there are two answers, plus 630 and minus 630. The minus 630 doesn't make sense for this problem, so final answer should be 630 meters. Notice the label is already here for me in WAMAP. Then I look at it to see if that makes sense. Now the drawing's not quite to scale because the 160 there is probably a little bit longer than it should be if you were drawing it to scale. But certainly 630 makes sense to me. It's less than the hypotenuse, which is 650. It would have to be less than the hypotenuse because the hypotenuse is always the longest side. So yeah, so 630 meters for the altitude of that plane makes sense.